The auction was not held in any square. There was no platform, no crowd, no auctioneer with a painted sign. It happened in a kitchen that smelled of lye soap and cold bacon grease on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1876, while the coffee was still hot and the flies still circled the unwashed plates. Ruth Alder's brother set his cup down, looked at the stranger across the table, and said, "$40 and she's yours. She can cook, she can clean, she don't talk much. Only thing wrong with her is she's hollow inside. Can't give you children, but you already got enough of those, I hear." The stranger was Josiah Crane. He was 41 years old, and the skin around his eyes had the cracked, sun-split look of a man who had spent 2 decades arguing with Colorado dirt and losing more often than he won. He had 4 daughters. He had a ranch east of Ridgeback where the creek ran thin by August, and the wind came down off the peaks like a hand trying to flatten everything it touched. His wife, Lenora, had been dead 14 months. He had not come looking for a wife. He had come looking for someone who could keep his youngest alive through the winter, because the child had already caught 2 fevers, and Josiah did not know how to cool a forehead in the dark without his hands shaking so badly the cloth fell off. He looked at Ruth. She was standing by the stove with her arms crossed over her chest as though she were holding her own ribs in place. 26 years old, thin, brown hair pulled back so tight it tugged the skin at her temples. Her eyes were the color of creek water over gray stone, and they were looking at the floor. "She agree to this?" Josiah asked. Her brother, a man named Orrin Alder, laughed. "She don't get a say. She's my property since our father died. No man in this county'll have her. You're the only fool desperate enough to take damaged goods." Ruth's hands tightened on her own arms. She did not look up, but her jaw moved just once, as though she had swallowed something that cut on the way down. "Now here is where I want to stop for just a moment and talk to you. If you are already holding your breath for this woman, if something in your chest has gone tight, then you are in the right place tonight. Do me a kindness. Tap that subscribe button, ring the bell so you never miss a story, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from right now? I read every single one. All right, let me take you back to that kitchen, to the sound of the flies, and to the deal that changed everything. Josiah paid the $40. He did not haggle. He did not smile. He folded the bills onto the table the way a man sets down a losing hand of cards, deliberately, without hope, because the alternative was worse. He told Orrin he would send a wagon in the morning. Then he put his hat on and walked out without looking at Ruth again. The screen door slapped shut behind him like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to read. Ruth watched him go through the window above the sink. She could see the set of his shoulders, the way he walked. Not fast, not slow, the gait of a man who had stopped being in a hurry about anything, because hurry implies there is something worth rushing toward. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the counter until the nail went white. Her brother was already counting the money again, smoothing the bills flat, holding one up to the light as though checking for forgery on a sum so small it would not have been worth the effort to forge. "You could say thank you," Orrin said. "I found you a roof." Ruth did not answer. She went to her room, a room that had been a pantry before their father died, a space barely wide enough for a cot and a hook on the wall, and she packed the carpet bag that held everything she owned. 2 dresses, a Bible with the spine cracked at Psalms, and a tin of salve she had mixed herself from beeswax and calendula. She closed the bag and sat on the cot and listened to her brother humming in the kitchen, and the sound of his contentment was the loneliest thing she had ever heard. She arrived at the Crane Ranch the following day in the bed of a wagon driven by a hired man who did not speak to her once during the 7-mile ride. The sky was the color of an old tin pan, flat and featureless, promising nothing. When she stepped down from the wagon bed, 4 girls stood on the porch in a ragged row like fence posts of different heights. The eldest, Bess, was 14 and already had her mother's stubborn jaw and a way of standing with her weight on her back foot as though prepared to retreat at any moment. The second, Pearl, was 11 and watched everything from behind a curtain of pale hair that she used the way some people use a locked door. The third, Cora, was 8 and held a crudely carved wooden horse against her stomach with both hands, gripping it so hard her knuckles were the color of old bone. The youngest, Nell, was 4. Nell was barefoot. Nell had a cough that came from deep in her chest and sounded like a drawer being pulled open over and over. Josiah stood behind his daughters like a man standing behind a barricade. "This is Ruth," he said. "She'll be helping around the house." "She's not our mother," Bess said. It was not a question. It was a fence being built. "No," Josiah said, "she is not." Ruth looked at the 4 of them. She looked at the house, which needed whitewash and new shingles, and had a porch rail held together with baling wire. She looked at Nell's bare feet on the cold boards, at the dark circles beneath the child's eyes. Then she picked up her carpet bag and said the first words she had spoken since leaving her brother's kitchen. "Which way to the well? The little one needs warm water and honey for that cough before nightfall." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Josiah pointed toward the side of the house, and Ruth walked in that direction without waiting for further instruction, and the 4 girls watched her go with the wary attention of animals observing a new creature that has entered their territory. Josiah showed her to a cot in the loft above the kitchen. It was narrow, and the mattress was stuffed with corn husks that crackled when she sat down like small, dry protests. There was a nail on the wall for her clothes. A window the size of a hymnal let in a square of gray light.
He stood at the top of the ladder and said, "I won't bother you. This is a working arrangement. You keep the girls fed and tended. I'll keep a roof and 3 meals. That's the whole of it." "That's the whole of it," Ruth repeated. Her voice was flat as a planed board. He went back down the ladder. She sat on the cot and pressed her hands together in her lap, and for a long time she did not move, and the only sound was the corn husks settling beneath her weight, like a field whispering to itself after the scythe has passed. But there was something Josiah did not know. There was something Ruth carried in her chest, the way a woman carries a stone in her pocket to keep from floating away. Not for comfort, but because she has forgotten what it feels like to walk without the weight.
The doctor who had examined her 3 years before, a man named Pruitt who practiced out of a room behind the feed store in Elk Falls, had told Orrin that Ruth was barren, that her womb was sealed shut, that she would never bear a child. Orrin had spread the word across the county like a man salting a field so nothing would grow there again. By the time Ruth understood what had happened, the verdict was already carved into the air around her: barren, cursed, empty. 3 words that followed her like dogs trained to bite. But Ruth remembered the examination. She remembered that Dr. Pruitt's hands had smelled of whiskey at 10 o'clock in the morning. She remembered that he had barely touched her before stepping back and delivering his sentence with the bored authority of a man who has already decided the answer before asking the question.
She remembered, too, that she had been ill that winter with a fever that settled low in her belly and left her bleeding for weeks, an illness no one treated because Orrin would not pay for a doctor, and the fever broke on its own, eventually, the way a bone knits crooked when nobody sets it. She had never been examined by another doctor. She did not know if Pruitt was right, or if the illness had passed and left her whole. She only knew that she had been too ashamed to ask, and that the shame had become a room she lived in, a room with no windows and no door, and she had stopped trying to leave it a long time ago. That was the wound she carried, not the barrenness itself, she did not even know if it was true, but the fact that a drunk man's verdict had become her whole identity, and she had accepted it the way a prisoner accepts a cell. Not because it is just, but because fighting seems like one more thing she cannot afford to lose. The first weeks were a siege of silence.
Bess refused to eat anything Ruth cooked and made her own meals from cold biscuits and jerky, standing at the counter like a soldier at a post she would not abandon. Pearl watched Ruth from doorways and around corners, but vanished the moment Ruth turned toward her, a pale ghost trailing the scent of cedar and horse. Cora sat at the table during meals with her carved horse beside her plate and said nothing, her eyes moving between Ruth and the horse as though comparing 2 things and finding one of them wanting. Only Nell, too young to understand resentment, let Ruth near her, and even Nell flinched when Ruth first touched her forehead to check for fever, a flinch so small it was almost invisible, but Ruth saw it and felt it land in her chest like a dropped stitch. Ruth did not push. She cooked. She swept. She boiled water and scrubbed the girl's clothes on a washboard until her knuckles bled and she had to wrap them in strips of flour sack. She patched the holes in Nell's stockings with thread she pulled from the hem of her own spare dress. She found mouse droppings in the flour bin and cleaned it out and sealed it with a new lid cut from a plank, sanding the edges smooth so no child could catch a splinter. She discovered that the kitchen window was cracked and stuffed with rags, and she mixed a paste from flour and lard and sealed it properly, and for the first time in what must have been months, the kitchen held its warmth past sunset. She worked the way a river works against a stone, not with force, but with relentless, patient presence, wearing away resistance so gradually that no one noticed the shape of things was changing until it had already changed. One evening she was sitting on the porch mending a tear in Pearl's dress. Pearl had ripped it climbing the fence to watch the horses when she heard a noise behind her. She turned. Cora was standing in the doorway, holding the wooden horse out in front of her like an offering laid on an altar by a child who does not yet know the word for prayer but understands the gesture. "My mama carved this," Cora said, "before she got sick. She said it was a magic horse that could run to the end of the world and back and always find its way home." Ruth set down the mending. She looked at the horse. It was rough, the legs uneven, the mane a series of shallow gouges made by a knife that was probably too large for the work. But someone had rubbed it smooth with love, the way hands polish what they cannot let go of, wearing the wood down to a softness that was almost like skin. "It's beautiful," Ruth said. "Your mama must have been good with her hands." "She was good with everything," Cora said, and then, very quietly, as though confessing something, "I'm forgetting what she sounded like." Ruth did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say. She simply held out her hands, and Cora set the horse in them, and the weight of it was almost nothing, a few ounces of pine, but it carried the gravity of everything this child had lost. Ruth held the horse for a long time after Cora went inside. Her thumb moved across the worn wood the way Cora's thumb must have moved across it 1,000 times before. Something opened in her chest, not a crack, not a collapse, but a door she had forgotten existed, swinging on hinges so rusted she had believed them sealed forever. She set the horse on the porch rail beside her and finished the mending, and when she went inside, she put it back on the shelf where Cora kept it, exactly where it had been. But the next morning she found it on her cot, placed on the pillow with deliberate care, the horse's carved head facing the window as though it were looking out at the world. And she understood that Cora had not lent it to her. Cora had given it to her. And the giving was a language older and more honest than any words an 8-year-old could have found. There is a truth that does not need a pulpit or a proclamation. A mother is made, not born, not from blood, not from the body, but from the 10,000 ordinary acts of showing up when no one asks you to. Ruth did not know this truth yet, but she was living it, one mended stocking at a time. The town of Ridgeback did not welcome Ruth. The women at the general store turned their backs when she came in, their conversations dropping to whispers that were louder than any shout because they were meant to be overheard. The minister's wife, a woman named Aldine Hatch, who wore her righteousness like a starched collar, made a point of telling anyone who would listen that Josiah had bought himself a Barren mule and that it was a disgrace before God and decent folk. When Ruth walked the mile to town to buy salt and lamp oil, she walked alone, and she walked back alone, and the road between was long enough to hear every word that had ever been said about her echoing off the hills. Josiah heard the talk. He said nothing about it to Ruth, but he began driving her to town himself, sitting on the wagon bench beside her with his jaw set and his eyes forward, daring any mouth in Ridgeback to open while he was watching. It was not protection in any romantic sense. It was the quiet stubbornness of a man who had decided that whatever Ruth was or was not, she was under his roof, and that made the town's cruelty his business. One night, after the girls were asleep, Ruth was cleaning the kitchen when Josiah came in from the barn. He stood in the doorway with straw on his sleeves and the smell of horse sweat and cold air rising off him. He looked at the kitchen, really looked at it, as though seeing it for the first time. The sealed window, the clean flour bin, the mended curtain, the floor swept so thoroughly the grain of the wood was visible. "Nell's fever hasn't come back," he said. "No," Ruth said, wringing out the dish rag. "The honey and the steam seem to help. I've been keeping a pot on the stove at night." Lenora used to do the same thing, with the steam. It was the first time he had spoken his dead wife's name in Ruth's presence. The word hung in the air between them like a lantern someone had lit and then set down in the middle of an empty road. You could see by it, but you could also burn yourself if you got too close. "She sounds like she knew what she was doing," Ruth said carefully. "She did." He paused. He took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it by the brim. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not the way you look, the way you don't quit." He went upstairs. Ruth stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and realized that her heartbeat had changed, that it was knocking against her ribs with an urgency that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a door opening somewhere inside her that she had thought was nailed shut. She pressed her wet hands to her face and breathed into them, and the water ran down her wrists and dripped onto the floor, and she told herself it meant nothing. She did not believe it. And that was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in years. Weeks turned. The aspens up on the ridge went gold and then bare, and the first frost came down like a blade laid flat across the valley. Ruth taught Bess how to make sourdough starter, and the day the first loaf rose properly, golden and cracked on top, with a hollow sound when you tapped the crust, Bess looked at it with an expression that was almost pride, a softening around her mouth that she could not quite control. She caught herself and walked away. But she ate 2 slices at supper and did not make her own meal that night, and Ruth said nothing about it because she understood that some victories are best left unclaimed. Pearl began leaving small things on the kitchen table for Ruth: a speckled hawk feather, a smooth stone from the creek, a sprig of dried sage tied with thread, without explanation or acknowledgement, the way an animal leaves offerings at the entrance to a den it has decided to share. And Nell had begun reaching for Ruth's hand when they walked to the henhouse in the mornings, her small fingers closing around Ruth's thumb with a grip that had nothing to do with balance and everything to do with the fundamental need to hold on to something warm. But Trouble had been watching the Crane Ranch the way a hawk watches a mouse cross open ground, patient and circling and certain of its right to descend. A man named Virgil Steen owned the largest cattle operation in the valley. He controlled the water rights to Placer Creek, which fed every small ranch between Ridgeback and the pass. Steen had been buying up land for 3 years, and the method was always the same: cut the water, wait for the rancher to dry up and fail, then offer a price so low it was an insult dressed up as mercy. 2 families had already sold and moved on. A third had simply left in the night, their house standing empty with the door open and the stove cold, as though they had been erased rather than evicted. Now Steen turned his eye to the Crane Ranch. The first sign was a fence. One morning, Josiah rode out to check his cattle and found a new wire fence strung across the point where Placer Creek entered his land. The posts were fresh-cut pine, still weeping sap like open wounds. The wire was new and sharp. There was no note, no name, but everyone in the valley knew whose hands strung Virgil Steen's wire. Josiah cut the fence. The next morning it was back, and this time there was a man sitting on a horse beside it, one of Steen's riders, a narrow-faced man named Dunphy, who wore his pistol on his left hip and had a habit of touching the grip when he spoke, the way some men touch a rosary, except what Dunphy was praying for was an excuse. "Mr. Steen says this creek runs through his land before it reaches yours," Dunphy said. "He's within his rights to fence it." "That creek has been open range water for 30 years, Josiah said. "Things change," Dunphy smiled, a thin, mechanical expression that never reached his eyes, like a crack in a mask. He tipped his hat and rode away. The water slowed to a trickle. Then it stopped. The cattle crowded the dry creek bed and lowed at the cracked mud, their eyes dull with a thirst that was becoming fear. Josiah drove them to a spring 2 miles north, but the spring was small, and the herd was large, and the arithmetic was merciless. That was the first wave. The second wave came from a direction Ruth had hoped was behind her forever. Orrin Alder rode up to the Crane Ranch on a Saturday afternoon, trailing dust and the sour smell of corn liquor. He had not changed. The same slope-shouldered slouch, the same small eyes set too close together like windows in a house built by someone who did not want to see out. The same way of looking at everything as though calculating what it might be worth if broken into pieces and sold. "Sister," he said from the saddle, not dismounting, "you're looking well, better than you deserve." Ruth was on the porch with Nell on her hip. She felt the child's fingers tighten in her collar, small fists gripping cloth the way a drowning person grips a rope. "What do you want, Orrin?" $40 was too cheap. I've been thinking on it. A woman who cooks and cleans and tends 4 children, that's worth a sight more than 40. I figure your man owes me another 60. Call it a fair adjustment." "You were paid." "I was cheated." His eyes moved past her to the house, measuring it the way a butcher measures an animal, calculating yield. "Nice place. Be a shame if folks in town started hearing stories about what really happened to you down in Elk Falls. The things Dr. Pruitt told me, the things I could add to what he said, if I felt like being creative." He smiled, and it was a smile she had known her whole life. The smile of a boy who pulls the wings off insects, not out of cruelty, but out of a boredom so deep it has become indistinguishable from cruelty. $60, Ruth, or I make your life here very loud and very ugly." He rode away. Ruth stood on the porch until the dust settled and the sound of hooves faded into the ordinary silence of the valley, and then she set Nell down gently. The child whimpered at the separation and walked to the side of the house and pressed her forehead against the rough logs and breathed until her hands stopped shaking. She did not tell Josiah, not yet. She could not find the words for what Orrin was threatening, because the threat was not violence or theft, but something worse. The weaponization of her shame, the turning of her wound into a blade pointed at the only peace she had ever known. But Josiah had eyes trained by years of reading weather and cattle and the moods of 4 daughters. That evening he watched Ruth at supper and saw something in her face that had not been there that morning, a tightness around the mouth, a pulling inward like a plant curling its leaves against a frost it can feel coming. After the girls were in bed, he found her sitting on the porch in the dark, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the horizon where the mountains were black shapes cut out of a sky thick with stars. "Who was that man today?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "My brother." "What did he want?" Ruth was quiet for a long time. An owl called from the barn roof, a sound like a question asked into an empty room. "He wants more money," she said at last, "and if he doesn't get it, he'll tell everyone in the county that I'm—" She stopped. Her throat worked. "That I'm what they already think I am." "And what is that?" "Broken. Empty. A woman no one should want." Josiah was quiet for a while himself. He was not a man who rushed to fill silence, and Ruth had come to understand that his silences were not absence, but a kind of thinking that happened below the level of words. Finally, he said, "You know what I think about that?" "What?" "I think my cattle are dying of thirst, and my neighbor is trying to steal my land, and my youngest daughter has started calling your name in her sleep when she has nightmares instead of calling for me. I don't have time to care what a drunk doctor said 3 years ago, and I don't have patience for a man who sells his own blood and then rides back for more." It was not a declaration. It was not poetry. But it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years, and it landed in her chest like a warm stone dropped into cold water, and the heat spread outward in slow rings she could not stop and did not want to. The pressure from Steen increased. One of Josiah's fences was cut in the night, and 12 head of cattle wandered onto Steen's land, where his men impounded them and demanded a fee for their return that amounted to nearly the value of the animals themselves. Josiah paid it, but his jaw was clenched so tight Ruth could see the muscles jumping beneath the skin. Then, 2 of the barn cats were found dead by the water trough. Poisoned, Ruth was certain, though she could not prove it, and knew that proving it would change nothing in a valley where Steen's money outweighed any man's testimony. Then a note was nailed to the fence post by the road, in handwriting that was blocky and deliberate. The letters formed with the care of a man who wants his threat to be perfectly legible. Sell while you can still afford to leave. And through it all, Orrin circled. He came by twice more, each time drunker, each time louder, each time lingering longer at the fence line, as though testing how far he could push before someone pushed back. The second time, Bess was in the yard hanging laundry and heard him call Ruth a name that made the color drain from the girl's face and her hands go still on the clothesline. That night, Bess did something she had not done since Ruth arrived. She sat down beside Ruth at the kitchen table after the others were asleep and looked at her with eyes that were too old for 14. "Is it true?" she asked. "What he said about you? Which part? That you can't have babies?" Ruth looked at her hands, spread flat on the table, the knuckles still rough from the washboard. "A doctor told my brother that years ago. The truth is, I don't know. I was sick, and the doctor was not a careful man. I never saw another one. But it doesn't matter what's true, Bess. It matters what people believe." "That's the stupidest thing I ever heard," Bess said. "Believing something doesn't make it real." "No, but it can make it feel real, and feeling real is almost the same thing when you're the one living inside it." Bess was quiet. She pulled at a thread on her sleeve, wrapping it around her finger until the fingertip turned red, then unwinding it. "Mama couldn't have babies after Nell," she said. "The doctor said she was done. She cried for a whole day, and then she got up and she never cried about it again. She didn't stop being our mother." The words hung in the air like notes from a bell that has been struck and will not stop ringing. Ruth looked at this girl, this stubborn, grieving, fierce 14-year-old, with her mother's jaw and her father's way of saying the hard thing and then looking away as though it cost nothing, and understood that Bess had just handed her something more valuable than any carved horse or speckled feather. She had handed her permission. Permission to be enough. Permission to stop carrying a verdict she had never deserved. A mother is made, not born, and sometimes the making happens in a kitchen, late at night, over cold coffee and a shared wound, while the wind presses against the windows like a living thing demanding to be let in. The siege came on a night in late November when the temperature dropped so fast the water in the horse trough grew a skin of ice between sundown and moonrise.
Josiah was in the barn tending a sick calf when he heard hooves. Not one horse, many, coming up the road at a pace that was not hurried but deliberate, the rhythm of men who believe they have already won and are coming only to collect. He stepped out and saw torches, 5 riders, Steen's men, led by Dunphy with the firelight catching the metal of his pistol grip, and behind them, on a mule, Orrin Alder, swaying drunk and grinning like a man who has finally found someone willing to pay for his particular brand of poison. They stopped at the fence line. Dunphy called out, his voice carrying flat and hard across the frozen yard. "Crane, Mr. Steen is making his final offer. $300 for the whole parcel. Buildings, stock, water rights, everything. You take the money and leave by morning, or we make things difficult." "And the woman," Orrin shouted from the back, his words slurring at the edges. "The woman comes with me. She's still mine by rights. Always was."
Josiah had a rifle. He had used it on wolves and coyotes, and once, years ago, on a man who had tried to steal his horses in the dark. But there were 5 of them, and 1 of him, and his 4 daughters were asleep in the house, and the mathematics of courage do not change just because the cause is righteous. The front door opened. Ruth stepped onto the porch. She was wearing her nightgown with Josiah's coat thrown over it, and her hair was down and her feet were bare on the frozen boards, and she stood there as though the cold could not touch her, as though she had spent so long being cold in other ways that the frost beneath her feet was nothing. She looked at the riders. She looked at her brother swaying on his mule. Then she looked at Dunphy and spoke in a voice that carried across the yard, clear and steady as a church bell on a winter morning. "I know who cut Josiah's fences. I know who poisoned the barn cats." I know that 12 head of cattle were driven onto Steen's land deliberately by riders who cut the wire first and mended it after, and I know that Virgil Steen's water claim on Placer Creek was filed in '69, 2 full years after the Crane family already had water rights recorded at the county seat. I know this because I walked to town 3 weeks ago and sat in the clerk's office for 4 hours and read every page of every filing going back to 1858. Silence. The torches crackled and spat. A horse stamped and blew a cloud of breath into the frozen air. If you ride off this land right now, Ruth continued, nothing happens. You go home, you tell Mr. Steen his offer is refused, and we all get through the winter. But if any one of you is still on this property when the sun comes up, I will be in the county clerk's office at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with a written account of every fence cut, every poisoned animal, every threat delivered by hand and by note, and a certified copy of the original water filing that proves Virgil Steen has no legal claim to 1 drop of Placer Creek. I will hand that account and that filing to the territorial marshal, who is in Ridgeback this week for the assizes, and then we will see what Mr. Steen's offer is worth. Dunphy's hand had fallen away from his pistol. His smile was gone. He looked at Ruth the way a man looks at a rattlesnake he has just realized was coiled at his feet the whole time he was standing there feeling safe. "You're bluffing," he said, but he said it the way a man asks a question he is afraid to hear the answer to. "Ride off, and you'll never have to find out." Orrin was off the mule now, stumbling forward with the loose-limbed recklessness of a drunk who has confused volume with authority. "Don't listen to her. She's nothing. She's barren. She's worthless. She's Orrin." Ruth's voice did not rise. It dropped. It became a thing with weight and edges, a thing you could cut yourself on. "You sold me for $40 to a man you thought was desperate enough to take anything, and I was desperate enough to be taken. But I am not yours anymore. I am not your property. I am not your shame, and I am not your income. If you come to this ranch again, I will tell every person in this county not what you say is wrong with me, but what you did. I will tell them you sold your own sister in a kitchen for the price of a second-hand saddle, and we will see which story the town believes." Orrin's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. He looked at Dunphy. Dunphy looked at the house, at the dark windows where, though he did not know it, Bess was standing in the shadows of the upstairs hall with her father's second rifle held in hands that were steady as fence posts set in concrete. "We'll be back," Dunphy said, but his voice had gone thin, the bluster leaking out of it like air from a punctured bellows, and every person in that frozen yard knew the words were a reflex, not a promise. They turned their horses. The torchlight shrank down the road until it was a cluster of orange sparks, and then nothing. The darkness closed back over the valley the way water fills a ditch, slowly, completely, as though the light had never been there at all. Josiah was standing at the corner of the barn. He had not moved during any of it. He had not needed to. He was looking at Ruth the way a man looks at something he has lived beside for months without seeing. A tree that has been growing in his yard all along, and suddenly one morning he looks up and it is tall enough to shade the house. "You went to the county clerk's office," he said, 3 weeks ago. "That's 11 miles each way." "I know how far it is. I left before dawn and got back after dark." "Why didn't you tell me?" Ruth pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. Her bare feet were white on the frost, and she could feel the cold now. Feel it climbing her ankles like water rising, but she did not go inside. "Because I have spent 3 years letting other people decide what I am. A drunk doctor decided I was barren. My brother decided I was property. This town decided I was cursed. I needed to do one thing, just one thing that I decided for myself. So I walked to town, and I read every piece of paper in that office. And I decided that nobody was going to take this family apart, not while I was in it." He crossed the yard. He took off his second coat, the barn coat, the one that smelled of hay and leather and work, and put it around her shoulders over the first one, and for a moment his hands stayed there, resting on the heavy wool, and neither of them moved. The silence between them was not empty. It was furnished. It was a room with the fire lit and the table set and two chairs pulled close, and they were both standing in the doorway, afraid to step inside because once you do, you cannot pretend you were only passing through. "Come inside," he said. "Your feet are turning blue." "In a minute." "Ruth." "In a minute." She leaned back, just slightly, until her shoulders touched his chest, and he did not step away. They stood like that in the cold, two people leaning against each other in the dark, and the stars above them were so thick and bright they looked like a promise written in a language neither of them could read, but both of them believed. The morning after the siege, Josiah rode to Ridgeback and spoke to the territorial marshal, a lean and quiet man named Harwell, who listened without interrupting and took notes in a small leather book. Within a week, Steen's water claim was under formal review. Within a month, it was voided. The original filing was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that, the dates altered with ink that did not match. The creek ran free again, and the ice melt that spring was the heaviest in years, as though the land itself had been holding its breath and finally let it go. Steen did not leave the valley, but he shrank. His operation contracted like a fist unclenching. Dunphy was not seen again after the first thaw. Some said he had gone south, others said he was in a jail in Denver, and nobody cared enough to find out which. Orrin Alder sent one more letter, a rambling, misspelled demand for $200, the handwriting lurching across the page like a man walking on a tilting deck. Ruth burned it in the stove without reading past the first line. She watched the paper curl and blacken and felt nothing, not anger, not grief, not satisfaction, only the quiet recognition that a door she had once been trapped behind was now behind her, and she was the one who had walked through it. She learned years later that Orrin had drifted to Kansas and died in a rooming house of the same whiskey that had fueled every cruelty he ever committed. She said a prayer for him and meant it, and then she did not think of him again. But those are the endings of small men, and small men are not what this story is about. On a Sunday in late January, Josiah came inside from the cold and found Ruth teaching Pearl to braid Nell's hair. The three of them were sitting on the floor by the stove, and Cora was beside them with the wooden horse standing upright on her knee, narrating in a low voice an adventure in which the horse galloped through a blizzard to bring medicine to a sick queen. Bess was at the table pretending to read a book, but watching over the top of it with an expression she was trying very hard to keep neutral and failing completely. Josiah stood in the doorway. He looked at the scene. He looked at it the way a man looks at a meal set on the table after he has been hungry for so long he forgot what it felt like to sit down and eat. Ruth looked up at him, and their eyes met, and in that look was every conversation they had not had, every touch they had not allowed, every word trapped behind the wall of the arrangement, the deal, the $40, the separate rooms. "Ruth," he said. "Yes?" He opened his mouth, closed it, took his hat off and held it against his chest like a man about to say grace or a man about to confess. "The cot in the loft. It's too cold up there in January. The corn husks don't hold warmth." "I manage." "I know you do. That's not what I'm saying." He took a breath that seemed to fill his whole body. "There's room down here, with me, if you want it. Not as an arrangement, not as a deal, as what it is, whatever it is. I don't have the words for it, Ruth, but I know what my house felt like before you came, and I know what it feels like now, and I'd be the biggest fool in Colorado to pretend I don't notice the difference." It was not eloquent. It was not a speech from a dime novel. It was a man standing in his own kitchen with hay on his boots and his hat in his hands, offering the only thing he had left to give, which was himself, whole and imperfect and afraid. Ruth stood up. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close enough to see the pulse in his throat, and she said, "I want it." He kissed her. It was clumsy and brief and tasted of cold air and coffee. And behind them, Nell clapped her hands, and Cora pressed the wooden horse to her chest and beamed, and Pearl covered her face with both hands but was laughing behind them, and Bess turned a page in her book and said, without looking up, "Took you long enough." They married in February on the porch of the Crane house, not in any kitchen, not in any church where Aldine Hatch could whisper from the pews. A circuit preacher rode 30 miles through the snow because Josiah had written him a letter that said, "I did one important thing badly, which was bringing this woman into my house as a servant when she deserved to walk in as a partner, and I aim to fix that, even if it means you ride through a blizzard to help me do it." The preacher came. He was a young man with frostbitten ears and a wide grin, and he performed the ceremony quickly because the wind was bitter and the bride's teeth were chattering. The girls threw dried corn because there were no flowers in February, and the kernels bounced off the porch rails and scattered across the frozen yard like tiny golden promises. Nell held Ruth's hand through the entire ceremony and would not let go afterward, and when Bess asked her why, the child said, in the clear, carrying voice of a 4-year-old who does not know how to whisper, "Because she's my mama now, and I don't want the wind to take her away." A mother is made, not born, not from blood, not from the body, but from warm water and honey for a cough. From mended stockings and sealed windows and 11 miles walked in the dark to a clerk's office because the people you love are worth more than the lie you have been living under. Years passed. The kind of years that settle over a house the way varnish settles over wood, each coat adding warmth and depth until what was once raw timber glows with the memory of every hand that touched it. Bess grew up and married a schoolteacher from Pueblo and sent letters home every month that were so full of exclamation marks and underlining that Ruth could hear the girl's voice in them as clearly as if she were standing in the kitchen. Pearl became the finest horsewoman in the county and never married, but was never alone because she had a gift for drawing people close without effort, the way a creek draws deer. Cora apprenticed with a new doctor in Ridgeback, a sober, careful man, nothing like Pruitt. And one afternoon, Ruth found her at the kitchen table reading a medical text on women's health, and the look on Cora's face was the look of a person who has decided that no woman should ever again be sentenced by a careless hand and a whiskey-soaked guess. And Nell. Little Nell with the cough and the bare feet. Nell grew tall and fierce and loud, and when she was 16, she stood up in the Ridgeback Church, the same church where Aldine Hatch had once held court, and told the congregation that her mother was the bravest person she had ever known, and that anyone who had ever called Ruth empty or cursed or worthless had been asking the wrong question all along. The question, Nell said, her voice ringing off the rafters, was never what was wrong with her. It was what was wrong with every person who looked at her and saw nothing. Ruth was sitting in the third pew. Josiah was beside her. His hand found hers and held it, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the rough map of 20 years of labor and weather and persistence, and she thought, this is what a life is. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of someone who stays. On the mantel above the fireplace in the Crane house sat a crudely carved wooden horse with uneven legs and a mane made of shallow knife cuts. 4 decades of handling had polished it to the smoothness of river glass. Visitors sometimes picked it up and turned it in their hands and asked about it, and whoever was nearest, any of the 4 daughters or Josiah or Ruth, gave the same answer, though they had never planned it and never discussed it. They simply said, "That's how we became a family." Outside, the Colorado wind came down off the peaks the way it always had, relentless and indifferent to human things. But inside the Crane house it was warm, and the bread was rising, and the carved horse stood on the mantel like a sentry keeping watch over everything that mattered. And the woman who had once been sold in a kitchen for the price of a second-hand saddle, sold as hollow, sold as cursed, sold as nothing, sat in a chair by that fire surrounded by daughters who bore her no blood and loved her past all reason. She was home. Thank you for staying with me through every word of Ruth and Josiah's story tonight. Those 2 and their 4 girls, they've been living in my head all week, and I'm glad I finally got to share them with you. Now, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your city in the comments. I read every one, and honestly, it's the best part of my night. If this story moved you, if you felt something, hit subscribe so you're here when the next one arrives. Until our paths cross again, take care of each other out there.